Okay. I will see what we can do. So if you're tuning in right now and fixing to watch us, we need extra hands for food truck on Mondays, 11 a.m. Be here a few minutes before that. If you can help out with that, that'd be great. If you have questions about that, you can see me, or you can talk to Treen, or you can talk to anybody else. All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're here. If you're watching online, we're glad you're joining us as well. I know that we have a few regular watchers, and so we're glad you're tuning in right now. If you're watching later, welcome. We're still in the book of Acts. We're going to wrap up Acts chapter 21 this week. We're only going to take 7 verses. We're going to kind of backtrack a little bit, look at a little bit of what we read about last week, and then we're going to finish this out going through verse 40. It's funny, we were taking chapters in chunks by the week, and then this one we've broken down into 3 weeks. And I'm kind of just setting the table for Jeff next week, because he's going to come back in next week and teach for a few weeks. And I'm just kind of setting him up for a great chapter. Acts chapter 22 is a great chapter, really interesting chapter. We see some great stuff from Paul in there. We see some typical response from the people of Israel, the people in Jerusalem. We see a typical response from them. But this week sets a lot of that up. It has a lot to do with that. And so we're going to wrap this up. We know that Paul is now in Jerusalem. We know that early in chapter 21, it was prophesied for him not to go to Jerusalem. At the beginning of chapter 21, a group of prophets interpreted what they received as a warning for Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Instead, it was more an instruction of what was going to take place in Jerusalem, and honestly was probably more for the people he was leaving behind to understand what was about to happen. Paul, we know, had already been told, you will go to Jerusalem, and this is what will happen in Jerusalem. It'll be a tough time. But Paul was going anyway because he was committed to what Jesus had called him to do. We hear Paul several times call himself a true disciple of Jesus, or an actual disciple of Jesus, being that he was actually called by Jesus himself. We see the conversion of Paul on the Damascus Road as he's traveling, and Jesus appears in the form of light. It's not an angel, it's not a voice, it's Jesus himself who appears to Paul. And Paul recounts that story several times. Matter of fact, he'll touch on it next week in Acts chapter 22. He'll touch on his conversion story. And as you read through the story, he highlights different points each time that he talks about it. And it builds this coalition of facts that Paul was truly chosen and called by Jesus, just like the other disciples were. And that's the difference in a true disciple of Jesus, or an original disciple of Jesus, or an actual disciple of Jesus, and other disciples who would come later. Because if you remember, John the Baptist had disciples. Every charismatic leader and speaker and religious zealot had disciples. But Jesus had true disciples that the Lord, in the form of Jesus, had called himself to follow him. He called 12. We know what happened to one of them, and then he replaces him with Paul. And so Paul, being that true disciple, like 100% bought into what Jesus wanted for him to do and God's plan for his life, even the threat of physical harm, bodily harm, or even the threat of loss of life was not going to be enough to keep Paul from following through with what God was calling him to do. Now we know in Acts chapter 21, as we get to the middle of Acts chapter 21, he shows up in Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and what happens there? People go nuts, as they always do when Paul goes to the temple. Anytime he goes to a temple or any kind of I'm blank on the word right now, but anyway, anytime he goes to one of the places where, the religious leaders meet, they lose it on Paul. At first they listen to him, then they get really upset, and then they chase him out, or they threaten him, or things like that. And We know that there's a group that like stirs up trouble against Paul. We know that there's a group that are probably from Paul's past. We see in some of the way that they react and respond to Paul that they are clearly someone who has been where Paul has been before and are familiar with Paul and his teachings, his interactions with Gentiles. And this is what really gets him upset, is his interaction with people in the Gentiles. I was going back here trying to find the verse 28. Men of Israel, come help us. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law of this place. And besides, he's even brought Gentiles into the temple and has defiled our holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they assumed that Paul brought him into the temple. So again, we know these men were probably from Ephesus. Ephesus being the place where they chased Paul out of the temple. He went and set up in the public meeting place to teach. And so that leads to them stirring up trouble, and they're basically becoming a riot, and they all rush into the court of Gentiles. Now, last week I showed you this map, or this picture, and I showed you this of Herod's temple and the court of Gentiles. This week I have this picture. This is a recreation, so this is a little clearer picture of what I put up earlier. So you see those two big open areas on either side of the cluster of buildings. In the center, that's the court of Gentiles. So this is where they've got Paul. Thousands of people are pouring into here, and they're beating Paul. They're hitting him, kicking him, spitting on him, pushing him, calling him names, threatening his life, all of these things. And then, of course, inside of that, we've got that little cluster of buildings, the tall structure that you see in the middle. That's the Holy of Holies. Out in front of that is the court of men. That's where the Hebrew men could go. They could not go into the Holy of Holies, but they could go into that court area. And then the larger area in front of that tall building that's walled in, that's the court of women. So that's as far as men could go in there too, but that's as far as Hebrew women could go. So they've got Paul in one of these open areas. And you'll see just to the right, that corner, a little different illustration of the Fortress Antonia. We're going to talk a lot about the Fortress Antonia here in a few minutes, but that's where the Roman garrison was stationed. And they were stationed there because that's where all the trouble seemed to happen. And so they stationed them there. And so they had very easy access. And this is going to be important in just a minute as to why that is. So they're beating Paul, and that's when the Roman garrison comes in and they take Paul in. So we're going to pick up there in Acts chapter 21, beginning with verse 33. And it says, then the commander arrested him. Hang on one second. My computer's behind here. Then the commander arrested him and ordered him bound with 2 chains. And he asked the crowd who he was and what he had done. Some shouted one thing and some another. Since he couldn't find out the truth, in all the uproar and confusion, he ordered that Paul be taken to the fortress. As Paul reached the stairs, the mob grew violent, and the soldiers had to lift him to their shoulders to protect him. And the crowd followed behind him, shouting, "Kill him, kill him." As Paul was about to be taken inside, he said to the commander, "May I have a word with you?" "Do you know Greek?" the commander asked, surprised. "Aren't you the Egyptian who led a rebellion some time ago and took 4,000 members of the assassins out into the desert?" "No," Paul replied. "I'm a Jew and a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia, which is an important city. Please let me talk to these people." The commander agreed, so Paul stood on the stairs and motioned to the people to be quiet. Soon a deep silence enveloped the crowd, and he addressed them in their own language of Aramaic. So we're going to kind of jump in right here. We see, let's go back, kind of catch up a little bit. The commander comes in, they arrest him, they put him with 2 chains. We learned last week that being bound with 2 chains doesn't mean that they put 2 separate chains on you. They put you in a chain on your left arm. That was the one guard. chain on your right arm, that was to another guard, right? So you were chained to 2 Roman soldiers. And this is kind of the this is kind of the conclusion of Erebus's prophecy about Paul. This is where the quote unquote the Hebrew people turn him over to his enemies, and he's bound by them, and so he's bound up by the Romans. The commander asks, "Who is this guy?" And everybody's shouting everything, right? Because they don't know why they're mad at Paul. They just got worked up by these guys, these Ephesians. They come storming in. It's kind of like jailhouse rules. Once it starts, everybody just jumps in. It's just a license to do crazy things, right? I was in Detroit with a group of students. Gosh, I don't know, 26 years ago. I was in Detroit with a group of students. And we were in a little community just outside of Detroit, actually. And the Detroit Red Wings won the Stanley Cup for the first time in decades. And that place went nuts. They were outside screaming up and down the streets, rocking cars, burning mattresses. You know, they were just going nuts because their hockey team had finally won the Stanley Cup. Very big deal there. Not as big of a deal in Knoxville. If Nashville wins the Stanley Cup, people are like, oh, that's great news. But we go on with life. There, it was like the big news. So they're rocking cars, burning mattresses, yelling and screaming. And I've got this group of teenagers, and all they want to do is go outside and jump in the crowd, right? They just want to rock a car. They want to set a mattress on fire. They want to run up and down the street. Why? They don't care if they won the Stanley Cup. They just want to get involved in the chaos, right? And that's kind of what happened here. It starts in something small. It grows to something large. And now people are just screaming all these reasons that they're arresting Paul. They don't know why. They don't know why they're angry at Paul. They don't know why they're beating Paul. So they're screaming all these different things. As a matter of fact, as it says, as they reach the stairs to go from the court of Gentiles up to the Antonia fortress, it says the mob grew so violent, even with the Roman soldiers there, they grew so violent that they had to put Paul on their shoulders to keep them from being able to continue to beat Paul. So they put him on their shoulders now, and they're carrying him into the fortress Antonia. And people, it says in verse 35, they're shouting, kill him, kill him. So this has gone from like, hey, we're really angry, to, hey, let's beat him, to let's just, now that you've got him, you guys have the right, you can kill him, right? And so now we learned last week that the crowd actually had the right to execute Paul on the belief that he had brought a Gentile into the inner court of the temple. That was the only thing that Rome would allow the Jewish people to execute someone for. And in their mind, in Rome's mind, while they never officially approved it, that kept the peace more than them intervening. So they were like, yeah, it's fine. You can kill somebody if they bring a Gentile in. You can kill the Gentile too. It's fine. And so now they're yelling, kill him, now that the Romans have him. Right? So now this causes confusion within the Romans, because the Romans now, they don't know what they've got in Paul. They now think that they have like a high value asset in their possession. Like they think that the Jewish people hate Paul for far different reasons than they actually hate Paul. So as Paul, though, is about to be taken inside, he says to the commander, may I have a word with you? And he says it in Greek, right? He speaks it in Greek. And the commander is shocked by this. And so he says, wait, you know Greek? He's very surprised by that. And we're going to learn why he's surprised by that with the next verse. So Paul says, hey, I need to speak to the people, right? Now, keep in mind, they've almost beaten Paul to death, right? If it hadn't been for the Romans interceding, Paul probably by this moment, he was probably, moments away from impending death. Because the crowd was getting larger, it was getting more violent, it was getting more angry. They were becoming to be more intentional with what they were doing, as you can see for the shouts to kill him in verse 35. And so he was moments from death. The people were rioting against him for no reason, unfounded reasons, right? The Romans had now arrested him because of it. And Paul's response is, he says, may I have a word with you? And his response, we're going to skip a verse. We're going to jump to verse 39. Paul says, I'm a Jew, a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia, which is an important city. Please let me talk to these people, right? These people, they tried to kill me. These people, they would have killed me if it hadn't been for your interruption. These people are blindly following false accusations. If you'll just put me down, let me address them for a minute, right? Like, Paul has this, it almost seems like Paul has this death wish built within him, right? He doesn't, though. He so truly trusts in God's plan for his life that he says, wait, I'm not done. I went there to talk to these people. I need to talk to these people, right? Let me speak to them. But the in-between of it, we get some idea of what's going on here. So we go back to verse 37. Let's jump back for just a second. Paul says, may I have a word with you in Greek? The commander, shocked, says, wait, you speak Greek? And then verse 38, we see this little nugget. Aren't you the Egyptian who led a rebellion some time ago and took 4,000 members of the assassins out into the desert? What? Like, what? The jump that this guy made, right? He goes from, they're beating this guy in the temple courts. I can't understand why they're beating him. He must be this Egyptian outlaw we're looking for, right? That's why they're beating him. Because this guy, just for some information about this, sorry, I had to find it in my notes here. He's talking about this particular zealot leader who had gone and started an uprising and tried to overtake this particular. His name was we don't exactly know his name. We think we do, but we're not exactly sure. But he led a large number of men to the Mount of Olives, and he was planning to take the Temple Mount, right? Temple Mount, which is where the temple is. He was planning to take the Temple Mount, and he had led 4,000 assassins. Now, these assassins were the Sicarii. The Sicarii are a group of Jewish zealots who were used for political assassinations in crowded places in daylight, and they used daggers to assassinate them with. So they would go into it, they would go through 3 years of training, these zealots would, and they would go into public places where political enemies were. Jewish political enemies, sometimes they were Romans, sometimes they were from foreign nations, whatever it may be. And they would go in the cover of daylight, in the midst of a crowd, and they were so secretive and so skilled that they would slip up on these people and murder them in daylight in a crowd and slip off without being captured, right? And so they were not just zealots, but they were revolutionaries, they were terrorists, and they were willing to fight and die for their cause. In the series The Chosen, if you've watched The Chosen at all, when we first meet Simon the Zealot, he's being trained in this camp, and you notice him using a dagger in that training. He's being trained as a Sicarii in the show. We know that he's known as being a zealot. We know that he's known as being zealous for the cause of Judaism and the nation of Israel. And so in the show, they make the assumption, they make the jump that he is so zealous for the cause of Israel that he's willing to go to these lengths and become this particular character who would murder these people. Again, it's a 3-year training, so it's like a special forces, basically, of these people. And Paul is mistaken for this Egyptian rebel due to his appearance and the rumors circulating at the time. Paul doesn't look like your average Jewish person. Now, why is that? Because while Paul was raised in the tradition of Judaism, he was raised in Roman and Greek territories. And so his appearance looks a bit different than the average Hebrew who's living in Jerusalem at this time. So they're confused by Paul's identity. And at first, they are a little hesitant to let him speak. because they think he's this guy and he's going to incite the people to rebel, right, and start another revolution. However, Paul identifies himself in verse 39 when he says, I'm a Jew and a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia. Now, this creates a problem because Paul will later in the next chapter further identify himself. Not only am I from Tarsus in Cilicia, but I'm a Roman citizen. And now this becomes a whole new issue because they can't arrest him as a Roman citizen. They have no grounds to arrest him as a Roman citizen. And so this starts a whole new problem. And so we're going to see in Romans chapter 22, he does very quickly get permission to address the people. Once he identifies himself as who he is, they're like, we better let this guy talk to the people, right? We need to let him talk to the people. But he asks for permission to address the people. And it says the commander agreed, so Paul stood on the stairs and motioned to the people to be quiet. And soon a deep silence enveloped the crowd, and he addressed them in their own language of Aramaic. So he begins to speak Hebrew to them. Here's the crazy part. We don't know why they got quiet. I mean, moments later they were chanting to kill him. They were beating him. And then Paul stands up and he starts to say, hey, listen up, listen up, listen up. So we don't know if it had something to do with his elevated position. We don't know if it had something to do with the fact that he had the Roman garrison behind him. We don't really know why they got quiet, but they get quiet. So here's a look at a close-up from that picture that we had earlier. This is a recreation from Jewish historians of the Fortress Antonia. So Paul would have been in the upper area of the Fortress Antonia. So he would have been elevated. So the Temple Mount is here, and then the Fortress Antonia was built on a slight rise above the Temple Mount. So the Fortress Antonia looked down into the Temple Mount, and depending on which side you looked out on, determined what you were seeing. So when Paul asked to speak to the crowd, he asked to speak from the steps leading up from the court of Gentiles into the barracks of the Antonia fortress. So he's elevated above them, and he's going to use that to his advantage to speak to them almost as if it's a reverse amphitheater, right? Instead of the speaker being down here and everyone sitting up above him looking down, Paul's now above them speaking down, and it echoes through that stairwell out into the court of Gentiles. So Paul is using that basically as an amplifier as well as a position to be able to stand and speak. So when he asks for permission to speak, he's standing there. When Paul stood before the council the following day, they again have to, because they'll send him to the Jewish council, he again has to be taken back up these stairs into the barracks. And so later the soldiers would, they would take him secretly at night from the Fortress Antonia back to Caesarea. So the Fortress Antonia was surrounded partially on this. You can see if you're facing it like you guys are to the right of the Fortress Antonia, you'll see that kind of deep area. That's actually a 165-foot wide ravine that was around the Fortress Antonia. So there's like a deep ravine that goes around it. And Herod actually constructed a secret passage from the fortress to the temple because this was Herod's before it was Rome's. This was Herod's little fortress before it was Rome's. It was built on a rock hill, which was higher than the temple area. It was about 75 feet above the temple area. And it had 4 walls that were intersecting. The western wall was built on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Tyropoeon Valley. The north wall looked across the hill of Bethesda, and then the southern wall was the wall that you could see over the entire temple area. So this wall that's the closest to the temple there, that's the southern wall, and so they could constantly keep a look over into the temple area. And then the eastern wall overlooked the pool of Bethesda and the Kidron Valley. Now the pool of Bethesda is located in an area that is down below the old city of Jerusalem. And it's a really neat area that you can go to. They're excavating that area now. It just got discovered in the last few decades, and they're in the process of excavating that area. It's a really, really neat area to go to. Josephus, the historian, he's the authoritative source for the description of the Antonia fortress. He writes about it in depth and about its interior. It's described as a small city inside of there. There's a palace. There's barracks for soldiers. There were apartments. There were places for marketers. There were baths. The Romans were very big on their public bathhouses. There were baths and large courtyards. There was a staircase that led down into the porticos of the temple. It's also written about the secret passageway. He also writes about the secret passageway that Herod built there. So that's another reason that the Romans took over this, is because of the size of it, because it was already built for a large group. And so this was the place that they were. A lot of Roman business took place here. The fortress was built around 35 BC, and it was named in honor of Herod's friend and the Roman triumvir Marcus Antonius. So I don't know who that is. You probably do. His name was Mark Antony. So the famous historical figure Mark Antony, this fortress is named after him. He was a friend with Herod. And so it was actually Mark Antony who had requested that the Senate make Herod the king of Judea as an eastern boundary to the Roman Empire. So at some point, the Romans overtook Antonia Fortress and placed their garrison there. So this is kind of a more detailed look at what that fortress might look like and what they were doing in there. And so Paul now stands on this staircase looking down into that courtyard, talking to these Jewish people. We're not going to see what he says this week. We'll find out next week exactly what he says. But it's important to understand a couple of things. First of all, we see that the people responded to Paul, right? They quietened down, they listened to Paul. And then we see that Paul began to speak to them in Aramaic. This is the second language in 3 verses that Paul has spoken. He spoke Greek to the Roman, and now he's speaking Aramaic to the Hebrew people. So again, it just shows us a little bit of Paul's education, right? We talk all the time about how Paul was raised in the tradition of Judaism, but raised as a Roman citizen. So he would have learned Greek. He probably learned Latin. He also would have learned Aramaic through his Judaism and his traditional teachings in Judaism, spending time at temple, things like that. He would have picked all that up. So what we really see here is Paul's absolute commitment to the cause of Christ, right? There's unwavering commitment there. Again, he's been severely beaten. He's chained between 2 Romans. It's been prophesied that this trip in Jerusalem would cost him dearly. And yet, what's on his mind? I just need to talk to these people, right? I just need to talk to them. I just need to tell them some things. Let me address the people who would rather see me dead than even see me in jail, right? They want you to take my life. And so he's going to move on into this conversation with them. And he says some interesting things in there. His choice of what he will say to them is kind of interesting and dramatic at the same time in chapter 22. Because again, it doesn't necessarily go the way that one would hope it would go. And so we're going to see kind of how that plays out as he begins to address them. But we see this idea of Paul's education. We see this idea of Paul's commitment to the cause of Christ. We see, again, Rome's complete and total misunderstanding about all things Jewish, all things dealing with Judaism. They fail to see, Rome fails to see time and time and time and time again the depth into which faith is woven into the Jewish culture, right? Because Rome it's polytheistic, right? They believe in every god under the sun. They believe in all of these Roman gods. They believe in Greek gods. They allow people to hold on to their own religions and even incorporate some of those into their own religion. They don't really have a a system of religion per se. Every God has its own system of religion, its own way of worship. And so there's no like just organized, this is what we believe and this is who we believe in. It's just kind of as long as you believe that the emperor is a deity as well, then we're great with whatever else you believe in. You just need to know the emperor's top of everybody. And as long as you believe that, we're great. And they can't wrap their mind around the fact that these people are so unruly and so unrulable, and it all hinges on the fact that their faith is so deeply rooted in who they are. And so they just can't figure out why these people would be so angry with Paul. And so they jump to this conclusion of he must be a political enemy, right? And not he's a religious enemy. Because to these people that have been whipped up and worked up, that's what Paul is. He's a religious enemy. They don't care about his politics. They care about the fact that he is telling Gentiles that they can believe in Jesus too. They're infuriated that he's telling Gentiles that if they believe in Jesus, that they don't have to convert to Judaism in the process, right? And so everything that they're upset with Paul about is religious based, and the Romans just can't wrap their mind around that. They just can't figure it out. And so they choose to assume one thing about Paul. Paul then reveals himself to be something else, and that leads us into chapter 22, which is going to be a really interesting chapter. So that's kind of the end of chapter 21. So it took us kind of 3 weeks to get there. But we saw a lot. We've seen Paul in multiple places. We see him travel to 4 or 5 different places at the beginning of Acts chapter 21 on his way to Jerusalem. We see him prophesied about by 3 different groups of people in Acts chapter 21. You've got the group of men early in chapter 21. Then you've got the sisters who are prophets, the daughters who are prophets. And we don't hear specifically that they prophesy over Paul, but we know that that's included. Their description as prophetesses are included, their ability with the gift of prophecy. So we know, we have to assume that they prophesied over Paul. And then we see the final Erebus prophecy over Paul. So he's been prophesied over 3 people. He's made his way to Jerusalem. Very quickly in Jerusalem, he stirred up trouble, got a lot of people angry, almost lost his life. He's arrested by Rome, and then he turns around and addresses the people who arrested him. In the process, showing off his deep education that he has. And we leave him on this stairwell in chapter 21. We leave him on this stairwell ready to address the citizens of Jerusalem and those who are visiting that have gotten stirred up and are so angry with Paul. And that's where Jeff will pick up with you all next week as we go into Acts chapter 22. So that's it. What we will see is that the rest of Paul's life, there's some debate as to whether or not from this moment on Paul is in captivity for the rest of his life. We know that Paul is in captivity for quite a while. We do have some historic evidence that he is released and then rearrested and he spends some time out. He still has another missionary journey. So we assume that Paul was released at some point. But for the most part, Paul's life as a free man is over. He will have some periods, it looks, of freedom. But he's always looking over his shoulder. There's always someone out to get him. And from this point on, for the most part, Paul will spend the rest of his life either in chains or looking over his shoulder for someone to get him. And this is when Paul begins to really write. It's during Paul's incarceration times that Paul begins to write his letters. And that's when we're really going to see the New Testament start to take form. Now, it won't be determined that it's the New Testament until a few centuries later, when it goes through a rigorous process of choosing. But this is when what we know to become the New Testament over the next years will come to life as Paul begins to write feverishly to people and to churches. And so we're seeing the foundational steps to the birth of the New Testament going on right now. Up to this point, the Gospels have been lived out, but not recorded yet. The book of Acts is being lived out and recorded, but not fully recorded yet, and were leading to the steps that would cause Paul to write. And he writes a good majority of the New Testament, and this incident right here directly leads to Paul going through long periods of incarceration where he would write feverishly much of the New Testament. So, so it's a pivotal moment. We may not realize it as we kind of work our way through Acts, but it really does lead to some pivotal moments in Paul's life. And ultimately in all of our lives, because of what Paul was capable of doing. The things that Paul would say and the things that Paul would write during this period following this incident are cornerstones of the New Testament church. So that's it. Even when it doesn't seem like much is happening, there's a lot going on. And we just got to learn to read the scriptures along with the history, and we can know exactly where we're leading. So thank you all so much for being here today. Again, I know that was kind of a weird one, just to kind of take that. Not a lot of gospel in there, but a lot of setup for what's about to take place. But I think it'll pay off next week when Paul starts to address the crowd. Jeff will be back in here, so you guys will get a lot of good information from him as well. And I'm going to pray for us, and we'll go. And then as soon as we get off, again, as normal, if any of you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for loving us and showing us truth and giving us so much information in the Gospels, Lord, in your New Testament. God, in the book of Acts, it's so deep and so rich, Lord, not just with facts and information about you, Lord, but just with history and allowing us to see the period and the goings on, Lord, what's taking place and the relationship between the Jewish people and the Romans and just all of this deep, rich rhetoric that goes on and these circumstances and happenings that take place. Lord, we thank you for that. May we always learn something every time we open your word and read it, God. We thank you for Paul and his commitment to you. May we emulate that in our own lives, Lord. May we look in the face of our enemies and say, but let me just talk to you for a minute. Let me just tell you one thing. Just tell you one thing. Lord, may we have that resolve and that commitment that Paul has in his life, Lord, as we move through our daily lives. We thank you again, Lord Jesus, for who you are and all you do for us. In your precious and holy name, amen. Amen. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you for joining us.